right, we're back again with Mike and Ken on our journey through the escape from Alcatraz. And as we all know, Ken's uncles were the guys who escaped, both of his uncles. And I just wanted to kind of give a little recap. When we started getting to, we just got onto the rock. John had just got on there, and I think Clarence would just got on there too. And they put him in. Believe you said they put him in separate cell blocks, but they quickly were able to get jobs in, what was it, the laundry room?
Actually, it was the cafeteria to begin with for John. Cafeteria. And eventually, Clarence would go in to being a barber. And then at some point in time, John would transfer over into the clothing room.
Got it. When I was going through the book again today, just before we started here, in the beginning of that chapter, there's a lot of letters from John back home, kind of explaining what it's like there. And it doesn't sound like he's talking about prison. He seems pretty happy. He seems pretty content. He talks about how the weather, he says, a little cold. He goes, the sea breeze reminds me of home. And he goes, everyone's pretty nice here. And actually the food is good. And I was looking through the regulations book, and it looked like they said that normal prisoners would only get about 2,100 calories a day. But the inmates at Alcatraz got 3,000 calories a day. And apparently it was considered some of the best food in the federal prison system. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what life was like there in comparison to the other prisons that they were, because obviously it was different, and it wasn't as bad as you would think it would be.
Yeah, that was the one thing that I picked up on John's and Clarence's letters that they wrote from Alcatraz. Was they did reminisce a lot about how it reminded them of home, the salty air, and I was even very shocked at one of Whitey Bulger's letters when he talked about being, he was in Leesburg Penitentiary at that time. And I guess it was just a horrible place to be. And he said at night he would reminisce about being back at Alcatraz, like he really wanted to be back there. And I think a lot of prisoners look back on it compared to other prisons that they were in. And it was actually a very nice place to be. I mean, you had your own cell, like you said. The food was awesome. Where else could you sit outside and look into the San Francisco Bay, look at the Golden Gate Bridge, and look at downtown San Francisco? But at the same time, it was like a double-edged sword, I would think it, and according to Whitey and to some of the other prisoners, because you could look out and you could see freedom, and it was almost like it was able to touch it, but you couldn't quite grasp it. And you could hear the sounds, and you could smell the smells of the hot dogs so at one point I would say it was probably one of the best prisons that John and Clarence ever went to. But then on the other hand, it just reminded them of the freedom that they didn't have.
Yeah. So, Mike, let's talk a little bit about, because you guys go into some of the mechanics of what that place was like their daily schedule. And I don't think you have to go through everything, but I think it's important that people understand, it was, like all prisons, it's very regimented. Their time is completely, monitored, and, they have to be certain places at certain times, literally right down to the last every 20 minutes. So if you're going to give the listeners kind of an idea of what they would be, John and Clarence would be experiencing during a normal day at Alcatraz.
Their life was every waking moment was basically accounted for. They woke up at approximately 7 o'clock every morning or a little bit before. They were expected to keep their cells clean. They had a booklet, rules and regulations that was, I think, 50, 60 pages that laid out all the requirements that the inmates were expected to know forwards and backwards. So any infraction of the rules would usually deal with some kind of a punishment. They basically only had a few rights as inmates. They had a right to housing, of course. They had a right to food, and they had a right to medicine. Everything else after that had to be earned. You know, if you wanted work privileges, you had to earn it. If you wanted to be a trustee, you had to earn it. If you wanted to go, they had movies there, you had to earn it. If you wanted access to the library, you had to earn it. And so they sort of dangled the privileges in front of them that if you behaved and, you know, didn't cause any problems, then life became more pleasant as you went along. And so when they got up, they were expected to be clean shaven. They gave them razors, which would actually play a part in the escape, you know, when they started formulating their plan, because that was a nice tool that they needed to create the false grills in the back of their cells. But, you know, they got up, they had to, like I said, be clean shaven, clean cells. They did head counts, and then they had to stand in front of their cells and be counted and make sure, you know, their shirts had to be buttoned up to the collars, and they had to be buttoned up with their sleeves, no rolling up of sleeves. And their clothes had to be clean. They had the laundry service, which we talked about, that, you know, John eventually landed at, was laundry / you know, clothing. So their clothes were clean. Then they went down to the kitchen area, and they had to be seated, as, you know, the guards would, you know, everyone had to stand in front of their table until the guard said you can sit down. Then you sat down at your table. And then you waited in line for your food. You said, you know, you can go back and get more if you wanted. That's one of the benefits of being at Alcatraz. And then you got up, you had to go back to your cell. Then they would count you again. And then if you had work duty, you'd go to work duty to, you know, they had various shops that they could earn a little bit of money, or work around the prison for various jobs. Like Alan West had he was kind of a handyman kind of a person, so he can kind of roam about the prison fixing things. But when they would but when they would arrive at their workstation, they would be counted again. And then when the work was over, they would go back to their cell, they'd be counted again. I mean, it was just all day long, there were head counts. I believe there were 13 during the day, so approximately one for every waking hour, approximately 12 hours. And then in middle of the night, you know, at midnight, they had a head count. At approximately 3 a.m, they had, you know, they would, you know, check to make sure everybody was in their cells. So they were constantly monitored. And then they also had metal detectors throughout the prison. Some were fixed at like the workshop areas. Those were there all the time because of, you know, the potential for inmates to smuggle out tools that can be used as weapons or digging instruments. And then they also had mobile metal detectors to just do random searches, you know, just to see if inmates were carrying contraband. And the inmates used to call those snitch boxes. That was their little nickname for them. So everywhere they went, they were being watched by the guards. They were being counted by the guards. They were having to go through the metal detectors. So the basic message for the inmates was, don't even think about escape. Don't even try, because we're going to catch you. One way or another, we're going to catch you. Either one of the snitches in the prison is going to rat you out, or we're going to find it ourselves, either through carrying contraband or the head counts, you know, which is about every hour. So even if you got away, you know, we would be close behind you to track you down. So very, very regimented. The only real free time they had was on the weekends. They can go into the exercise yard. That was the very valued time where they just kind of roam around the yard, play basketball or baseball, or just hung out on the steps. And then also in the evening time from 5 to 9, after they had their last meal of the day, until 9 o'clock, which was lights out, they can be in their cells, you know, writing, painting, practicing a musical instrument if they wanted. It was unstructured time. But other than that, all the other time was very well regimented.
Yeah. So the reason I had you go through that, because I want the listeners to understand how little time they had to kind of plan and make these things that they would need for the escape, whether it's the rafts and everything. And when they were doing it, they'd have to do it pretty damn quick and very stealthy, so no one would know. And the fact that they did it in a year and a half after they pretty much were in there is pretty a monumental task. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So what did you learn, Ken, from doing all this research about what it was like for them to kind of start planning this and all the obstacles that they would need to overcome to get to the eventual escape?
Well, like I said, I believe John, from one of his letters, he was planning this even prior to getting to Alcatraz, on the boat on the way out to Alcatraz. And kind of like Mike said, you know, the regiment that they had to go through was pretty strict. And so they only had, you would think, a short period of time at night to do their planning. That once they decided, okay, this is how we're going to do it. But and maybe that's one of the reasons why, according to Wes, when he gave his testimony to the FBI, one of the first things they created was the heads. And that was because once they created those heads and the fake grills, well, that pretty much gave them all night long until, you know, from the time the lights went out until 7 the next morning, they could pretty much be out of their cell the whole time.
I wanted to stop you right there because you just kind of jarred a memory for me. I think when Clarence first went into his cell, that was the first thing he noticed, was that vent.
Yes.
So talk about that. Talk about what he noticed and what did he see?
Well, you know, John and Clarence both noticed that when they reached down and looked at the vent, that they noticed that the concrete around it was starting to kind of flake off. And, you know, like I said, when you're someone like John and Clarence, they're always thinking about what is the opportunity that is setting before me that no one really kind of notices. And Clarence notices the grill, and he notices how, wow, this concrete is not as strong as people probably thought it was. And as he kind of poked around at it, he noticed, and it wasn't the cell that he would eventually, you know, be in when he started the digging with his brother John. But he noticed, okay, if one cell is like that, more than likely every single one of them is like this. No one's really kind of thought about going out the back of the cell. They always think of, you know, during the daytime, I'm going to make a run for it, jump in the bay, or we're going to try to overtake some guards and force our way off the island. But I don't think anyone ever thought about going out of the back of their cell. And that was just the creativity that I believe that my uncles had. I mean, you know, they might not have scored 136 on the IQ test, but they were very intelligent men.
Yeah. Clever like foxes.
Clever like foxes.
Did you have something to say?
Well, no, I just think tapping into the creative part of it, because you'd have to be really creative in order to be able to come up with a plan to escape a place like that when you're in the middle of the ocean. And just the way that you were describing how they described looking out the window just felt to me like they had creative tendencies. They were probably a little artistic in ways that they probably never explored, maybe writers or musicians or whatever. There just seems to be like a romantic feel to the way that they looked at their sentence at Alcatraz, I guess, because they knew they were going to try to escape or that they were going to get out. But how did they manage to get the materials? This is the part that baffles me. How did they manage to get the things that they needed in order to plan the escape? I mean, that part I just can't wrap my mind around.
And keeping it hidden.
Keeping it hidden from people.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, most of the materials that they got were items that they could have ordered. Like, for instance, you know, John and Clarence both, and even Frank Morris, they ordered cardboard, or not cardboard, but the materials that you would use for painting a painting, which they did paint. And they would use that not only to paint with, but they also used it to create the fake vent. They had several of them that they would put together. So there were a lot of materials that could easily just been, you know, acquired by just asking for this material. And like Mike said, the razor, for instance, that was an item they already had in their hands. The soap that they used to keep clean with, they used part of that. And so a lot of the items were already kind of in their disposal of tools that they could use. That was one thing that I believe that set John and Clarence and even Frank Morris apart from the other prisoners, is that they didn't need to order a bunch of stuff or steal a bunch of stuff in order to make this escape occur. They just used whatever material was around them, pretty much like they did when they were growing up. You know, we discussed earlier how that John and Clarence both would create toys for their siblings to play with And it wasn't that they could go down to the local Home Depot or Lowe's. There was nothing to go to. They just simply picked up stuff, out of a scrapyard or something that was lying around the house, and they invented stuff from it. So you can kind of see that same ingenuity and creativity when you read the FBI files, and they're like blown away, like, creating a periscope. I mean, who would have thought of using that, or creating a homemade flashlight? I mean, I can't even imagine how to create something like that. And yet they were able to reach and grab certain materials, and they go, "Hey, I know how to do this." Or, gosh, it just blows my mind sometimes when I think of what they created and how they used each of those tools.
Highly intelligent.
Just to add to that, like for the dummy heads, for example, one of the things that they did was from the library, they had access to magazines. And so they can, check out magazines and read them in their cells. Well, one of the things that they did to not be too obvious about cutting out pages and using the paper for the paper mache is they actually focused on the little cards, the little ad cards to renew your subscription that everybody hates, nobody wants. And so they pull those out. And then when they were digging their cells, they're digging concrete and they're creating like little concrete dust and little bits of concrete. Well, they use that as sort of like a form of cement. They mix it with water, and like Ken said, they had the soap, and so they would use the paper, the soap, the concrete, and that's how they were able to form the dummy heads. And of course, they had the painting set that they used to paint, and Clarence was the barber, so that's how they got the hair. And then through Alan West, because like I said, Alan West, had a lot of repair materials. He had glue. So they can use the glue to glue the head on top of the heads. And then with the razor blades, what they did was, when you have a binder, that has a hard cover on it, well, it's a cardboard cover front and back. Well, that's how they used that's how they created the fake grills, was they cut the cardboard to the dimensions of the grill. And then they glued it with the glue that they had. And with the razors, they were able to cut the little crisscross pattern to replicate, the wire that was in the back of the cell. So from a distance, so they can do very precise cutting with those razor blades. And then of course they painted them, they put them over the cell block or the back of the cell block. And so when they were outside, either working in the utility corridor or then later when they were working on top of the cell block, when they were creating the rafts and oars and life vests, they just, of course, would put the fake grill over the front, put the dummy head in the bed, and then they could be in the utility corridor on top of the cell block, as like Ken said, pretty much all night long, as they stayed quiet and didn't, arouse any suspicion. Then they just went out there night after night after night. So a lot of people kind of think that they only used the dummy head one time when they actually escaped, and then, made their way off the island and got away. But they used those dummy heads many, many times over many, many nights. And we have an interview from one of the guards who was asked about the dummy heads after the escape. And he says, at nighttime in the dark, when you're walking past a cell, they looked as real as anybody. They aroused no suspicion whatsoever. And they didn't even think about that this would possibly be a fake.
And that's what's so amazing, that so many nights the guards would walk by and they wouldn't even be in their cell. The guards, it wasn't like Mike said, they didn't fool them that night that they escaped. They fooled them for many nights. And just amazing how that the guards never even picked up on it.
I think that's also a testament to their superpower, which is to kind of be underestimated. People underestimated how smart these men were. I mean, the creative ingenuity that they exhibit while they're preparing for this escape. It's like you said, we just take for granted we could just go to Lowe's,
and that was probably the reason why the warden from Leavenworth tried to warn the warden at Alcatraz, Blackwell, that do not put these two men together. They're undoubtedly, he recognized how creative they were and how cunning they were, and that they could just use anything, and they were thinking outside of the box. And so, he tried to warn him, do not put these two men together. And, you just put the perfect storm together when you put them two together.
Did he ever send an "I told you so" letter back to him after the escape?
It's probably something he should have gotten.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Amazing.
Now, one of the other things I just remember that they did that also just shows to how ingenious they were. They discovered that there was a vacuum cleaner that had an extra motor inside the casing that was like a backup motor. And so what they did was they managed to take the motor out, smuggle it back to their cell block, and then with the help of another inmate, they were able to get a drill bit. And so what they did was they fashioned a drill out of the motor because it just spins, and that's what a drill does, it spins. And then when they were on top of the cell block, when they were dealing with the problem of getting through the air vent at the top, they couldn't do much with the bars because that was hard steel, but they realized that if they cut the bolts, it would remove the whole casing, and then they could just slip out to the top. And so they also managed to get an extension cord. They somehow got that, and from the top they tapped into the electricity, the wiring up there, and then they were drilling on top during the music hour from 5 to 9. So as inmates were making noise and playing music and so forth, they were able to drill without being heard, and that also aided in their escape. So they fashioned a drill. It's just these guys they were always thinking, they were always looking for what can we use here to help us.
And
I remember
somehow they were able to acquire not 100-foot extension cord, but multiple ones. Like, how in the world do you allow a prisoner to have access to an extension cord? I mean, it's like, and then the materials that they left behind, because when they finally got up to the top of the cell house, and I mean, there were items that they had put into a bucket and put cement into it, trying to, I don't know why they were trying to cover it up. I mean, once they were gone, they were gone. But there were many, many items that they left behind. And so just think about all of the items that they were able to acquire, and they assembled like this workshop up on top.
Yeah,
And,
no, I mean, there's a lot of photographs of the stuff they
yes.
left behind. I mean, I've seen them, and we'll put them up here when we're talking about them. But yeah, there was a ton of stuff, and like
Yes.
everything from, and a lot of it was like literally, like you said, it was fashioned out of
Mhm.
everyday things, anything they could use, and like they would like fashion these tools for one specific type thing that they needed,
Right.
and then they'd have like 10 others tools that would do
Yeah.
little things as well.
And to me, when I first did the show in 2015, and I was working with this U.S. Marshal, we talked, when we're talking right now, we're talking about the detail that they took and putting together this escape, all the material that they used, everything that they did. And I asked him, I said, do you really believe that if they were that detailed in planning this escape, getting down to the water, and then they were just going to go, okay, what do we do now? Like, they didn't have a plan? Like, anybody who believes that they just got down to the water and said, oh, let's just put the raft in the water and try to make it to Angel Island. That's our plan. It's like, if they were that detailed in planning it and creating this and getting down to the water, I promise you they had a plan that was already in place they were going to use once they got to the water.
Did the prison know that they had relationships with all these people, Frank Morris, Whitey Bulger,
No.
Mickey Cohen? They didn't.
No.
They had no clue
No.
that these guys
No.
knew each other.
Nope. Not until, they started interviewing the prisoners. And that was something that I think was so key to me when I first started doing the research early on. I put down all of these interviews that I read in this FBI file into 3 groups. They interviewed prisoners, and then they interviewed family members and friends, and then they interviewed the public. And I believe once maybe a year or so, they started realizing, probably right after Alfred's death, because that's when they interviewed Alfred's cellmate. I believe that's when they first realized that Mickey Cohen was involved in this process, in this escape. And I don't think they knew it up until that point.
And that was what, a couple years after?
That was, so my Alfred died in the first part of 1964. So the interview must have taken place right after, because as they're interviewing his cellmate, he references Alfred's death. So I know Alfred had already died, which was totally shocking and amazing that they would interview every single prisoner in Alcatraz. They would interview prisoners in Leavenworth, Lewisburg. They even went back and interviewed prisoners in the state prisons that they were in, but not one time, unless they purposefully left it out of the FBI files, there was no interview that they ever did with Alfred.
Wow.
What in the hell are you thinking about? Here's and later they learned that not only did he know what happened to them, but that they even told him through a letter early on. John did, or either Clarence, one of them. Doesn't say who notified him, but they let him know that they were planning, not that they were doing it, but they were planning an escape from Alcatraz. So
yeah, I
read, knew about it.
I saw that, and I saw how that it kind of slipped through the censors, that one.
Well, you know, they used to do their code that they would use wasn't like in a written form. Hey, I'm escaping Alcatraz, or we're planning. They would use code, which we found out more or less like a line. They would have 3 lines from what we understood, and each line represented something, and the length of the line represented something. And so, if you saw 2.5 lines, it meant, it might have meant, okay, we're in the process of doing something. If it was 2 lines, it meant, all right, we're fixing to do something. And if it was 1 line, we've already done it. So it was different ways that they would code stuff into the description of what they were doing that probably a regular individual, it's just scribbish,
And then when did they come up with this plan, this code? I mean, obviously
they did it as kids. This was something that they did from the very beginning. They would, my uncle, who we later would find out would be a part of this process, he even told in an interview that they had codes of calling each other, and they would let their phone ring X amount of times, and then they would hang up, and then they would do it so many times meant something to the other one. And so they had all these different secret codes that they would use with each other. They were like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of the movie where they had this code system.
It's spycraft. It's like spycraft.
Yes. And they would use that to communicate with each other. So even if one of the prison guards who were reading the letter, it would have meant nothing to them. But it meant everything to to Alfred, because like I said, his cellmate said, Alfred told me early on, even way before the escape, that they were planning it. And he said, Alfred told me he did not hold out a lot of hope that it could be done.
So the FBI did not question Alfred at all after the escape?
If they did, it was never recorded down.
Except for that, what we believe and what you believe is when he was probably interrogated after the fact, which led to his electrocution death. Yeah.
Right. And this would be after he left Atlanta, and he was now in Kilby Prison in the state penitentiary in Alabama. So it was like a year or so after the escape. But what is just so amazing is that when you go back and you read all of the documents that are in the FBI file, they interviewed every single family member, relative. The only name that was ever redacted was Alfred. They mentioned his name as a family member, a brother. But when you go into the to all of the listings that they did of the interviews with either the family members or with any of the inmates, Alfred is never interviewed. Now, like I said, he could have been interviewed, and they just never put it into the files. I would love to know if that ever occurred. But as we go back and you look at that interview that they did with his cellmate, then when I read it and I realized what was going on and what was being said, my Uncle Man comes to see Alfred right after the escape, when it was told, I think we've mentioned this, that, Alfred was gloomy. He was upset because, who wouldn't be? You just got through reading that your 2 best friends, your brothers, were dead, and he's probably believing this. And then all of a sudden, Uncle Man shows up and tells him something. something that his cellmate said just turned him around. Like he said, Alfred was his old cheerful self again. Like he came out of that meeting and he was like, oh, not only do I know that they made it, I even know who helped them. So Uncle Man tells him that Mickey Cohen sets up a boat for them to get on in the middle of the bay. And so then I started thinking, oh my gosh, no wonder out of all of the family members that the FBI interrogated, or I say interrogated, threatened with jail time. I mean, think about this. The next morning, all of my relatives are threatened that if you know anything about anything, if you know where they're at, if you have any knowledge of their escape, you're going to prison. Threaten them with prison time. And so all of those people, nobody was polygraphed except one brother. And it was the brother who went to see Alfred a couple of days after the escape and told him that they were okay and that Mickey Cohen had helped. He's the only family member that has ever been polygraphed.
So I guess he passed the polygraph.
You know, the last time, so he, not once, but twice, the last time that he was polygraphed, the U.S. Marshals came and picked him up and didn't tell him where they were taking him. Took him. He told this story to us. So they took him off and asked him a bunch of questions. He never told us what the questions were. And one of my aunts said, "Well, did you pass?" And he said, "Well, I guess I did, but I'm not sure how." I was like, what? They never came back and asked him again. They never came back and picked him up, never did it again. But of all of the family members, he's the only one that ever gave him a lie detector test.
Wow.
And I never understood why until I read that FBI document. And you know that they had to know that he was the one who came to Alfred and told Alfred, yes, they made it, and who helped him.
Wow.
So, and you got to ask yourself too, how in the world did Uncle Man know Mickey Cohen? I mean, this is a guy, and I mean, how did he even know who he was? And why in the hell would Mickey Cohen help my two uncles?
Yeah.
Why would he do that?
Well, do you think Fred Breezy let him know?
You know, either when Mickey Cohen got out on the bond, you know, back then, like I said, they didn't have tracking systems. There was no ankle monitors. There were no ability to track someone from, you know, flying through an airport and we can do facial recognition. You either were probably tailed by an FBI agent or, you know, if that was how they were keeping tracks of him. So whether or not he is the one who actually went to Ruskin and met with my Uncle Man, or whether or not he got in touch with Fred Breezy, and Fred Breezy is the one who came and met with Uncle Man and said, okay, your brothers need help. Mickey, you know, we're going to set a boat up out in the middle of the bay starting at a certain period of time. And we need to be able to get them out of the country. You know, somehow my uncle played a part in which very few people know, even today, that he sent. I had two aunts that were out in San Francisco during that time frame. And right after their escape, they came back to Ruskin, Florida. And one of the husbands of one of my aunts worked on a fishing boat. He used to work on these fishing boats out of Alaska. So he knew these big, huge boats. And so it's just amazing that the boat that picked them up in the middle of the bay that Officer Chechi saw was a fishing boat. You go figure that.
Getting back to Mickey Cohen, I can think of two reasons why he would want to help them. Number one, he already knew how useful they were, and he knew they were going to have to leave the country. And so that, you know, if he was expanding his drug empire into Mexico or South America, he knew he could rely on them, and he knew if he got them out, they would be forever indebted to him.
I agree.
And number two, he'd want to embarrass the government by helping them escape and getting that going, because that would be a huge embarrassment and a huge FU to the federal government that they were able to escape from the inescapable Alcatraz Island.
You know, but you think about this, which I've often thought about this many times, running through my head. If he really wanted to embarrass, say, J. Edgar Hoover or the federal prison system, like, you know, James Bennett, and he really wanted to make them look bad, why in the world did every opportunity that they had, now I'm talking about the federal government, James Bennett, the FBI, why in the world did every turn that they had the opportunity to follow up a credible lead and go after these men and, you know, capture them and say, hey, you know, we can prove no one ever escaped from Alcatraz. And they just simply ignored it. I mean, it's almost kind of like me, you know, someone that I know escaped, and you're an FBI, you know, person that's after them, or the U.S. Marshal, and I come and give you credible information. I saw them jump in a 19, you know, or whatever car, and this red and black, and they're heading south on I-75, and you go, nah, I don't believe that.
Why do you think? Why do you think they did that?
I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on here for a second and go full conspiracy theory. During that time, if you remember, you got the JFK assassination, who they believe, obviously, and even RFK believes that the CIA, and what we know, the CIA was involved, that the mob was involved. There was like an intertwining of a lot of groups during that time. And so you never know why they may have not dug deeper, because maybe they would expose themselves for other things. And was it really worth exposing it for the greater good of what their big plan was to continually control people? So I would say that could be a possible reason, because Mickey Cohen, you know, big mobster, they felt like, the mob, Joe Kennedy was instrumental in getting the mob to get him, in Chicago and all that stuff, get him elected. And when the two brothers went after the mob after that, a lot of people who've studied this subject said that was a big, no, because we got you elected. Now you're coming after us. And then along with that, in the CIA, because JFK was trying to change a lot of things on way how to govern. He wanted to get rid of a lot of government agencies. Mm-hmm. So he was a disruptor. Well, and so you had two things against him.
Well, so like, again, think about this. Think about if you were a criminal and you're sitting in prison and your lawyer wants to bond you out because they want to do an appeal. Do you think right now that he would have any chance going to John Roberts, the Justice of the Supreme Court, himself, and him signing your bond for you to get out of prison? Do you think that would happen today? No, absolutely not. I mean, you're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States. You're not talking about a local judge that is doing this. And so here is, here's, can't think of his name, but it just left me. Mickey Cohen, okay, mm-hmm. He's in prison, and the Chief Justice of the United States of the Supreme Court signs his bond for him to get out of Alcatraz so that he can go appeal his case. So what in the world is the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice now, we're not talking about just a justice, the Supreme Court Justice is signing his bond for him to leave Alcatraz. The only person in the history of Alcatraz to walk out of that jail and then turn around and come back.
You just made one slight mistake, Ken. It was Earl Warren who signed the bond.
Earl Warren. Yeah.
Earl Warren.
Well, I was talking about today's time, not would that ever occur.
Yeah.
No, it would not occur.
Right. Well, we know Mr. Warren was involved in a lot of shenanigans. So it doesn't sound too far off the mark to think that something else was going on at that time to get him out, and it was some sort of influence peddling to get him out.
There's also a document in the FBI report that was written to J. Edgar Hoover, and it was one of the agents that was sort of giving them a summary of what they had found during their investigation after the escape. And one of the things it specifically references is the boat that picked up John, Clarence, and Frank. And it said the only person that could have possibly helped them, the escapees, with this was somebody who was in the prison at one time who knew them. They were sharing information. He was aware of the plan, who gets out of Alcatraz and then has the means, financial means, and the ability to arrange a boat to be set up at a certain time, and then communicates this information to the three escapees. Well, it would have been four at the time before Alan West, he decided not to leave. But to the escapees, well, who fits all the criteria for that? Who checks off all the boxes of information, money, infrastructure, organization, motivation? He was highly motivated to do it. A regular inmate does not have that ability to do it. They don't have that kind of money or resources. Only one inmate does, and it's Mickey Cohen.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and another thing that was interesting was in that meeting that Fred Breezy did with the Anglin family in 1992, and I believe we sent you the audio of it. But at one of the very beginning parts of it, one of my aunts asked Uncle Man, who's sitting right beside Fred Breezy, about how information could have gotten out in order to help set up this escape process. And he said, Uncle Man said, "Oh, well, all you had to do was find someone who was leaving the island. They could have carried the information out." And this is in 1992 now. This is before any of the FBI files had ever been released. He knew what happened. I mean, just a clear indication, even in 1992, he had knowledge of what happened.
So that picture you sent me where they're sitting around the dining room table and you have Fred Brizzy sitting in the center, and then who's the woman sitting next to him? Is that your mother?
That's my mother.
And then the other person is Uncle Man?
That is Uncle Man. That is Uncle Man.
He has got the biggest shit-eating grin on his face. It's just like, when you just explained to me that he knew all along, he's just sitting back and goes, "Yeah, go ahead, tell him, Fred. Tell him what it's just so funny, the look on his face."
Well, and if you listen to the audio, a lot of times as Fred is describing Brazil, and he's talking about the law and different things, Uncle Man a lot of times would answer the question for him. He would go, "Yeah, they didn't have a lot of law out in Brazil at that time," and so he's like answering a lot of these questions that the family is asking Fred, and Uncle Man's just like firing them off, like, "Okay, I know this. I need to answer this for you." It started making sense whenever I discovered that Mickey Cohen was involved in this from that FBI interview that they did with his cellmate. And then everything kind of started clicking, like, oh my gosh, it was like the missing piece of a puzzle. Now all these other pieces that I've seen and I've tried to fit into places and I didn't quite understand how that fit. Now everything started falling together. And I was like, no wonder they interviewed my uncle multiple times. No wonder he's the one who knew, where they went and kept in touch with them. It's like, they didn't want other members of the family knowing this because, like I said, they were threatened with jail time. I mean, can you imagine how frightened and scared every single one of them was in the 1960s?
Oh my God.
The federal government is coming to you, they're poor. They have no means of hiring a lawyer, and they're coming in and threatening you with going to prison.
Yeah,
every single one of them. My uncles knew right then, do not share anything with any family member. And nobody was ever told until much years later.
Except for Uncle Man.
Uncle Man is the only one. Well, he's the only one they ever interviewed either. Once they found out that it was him, they realized, he was the key to this thing.
Wow. How long did Uncle Man live to?
Oh my gosh. He was in his 80s, his early 80s. He didn't live that long. He died, I believe it was in 2009 is when he died. And on his deathbed, as he's dying, he tells my aunt and my mom, the only two living sisters alive today, that he had been in contact with them for 25 years.
Wow.
That he had been in contact with their brothers, not to worry about them. They were fine, and he had kept in contact with them for over 25 years.
Wow.
So he, on his deathbed, he confessed to them that, you know, he pretty much knew where they were at.
So your mom is still alive?
My mom is still alive, and my her younger sister is still alive, not in very good health.
Oh, okay. I'm sure she's aware of you been doing all this.
She is.
What does she think of it?
She's you know, sometimes her mind's not as good as it used to be. I'm taking her a book this weekend. She wants to read it. She loves anything that keeps her brother's memory alive, because she believes, just as I do, that, you know, history rewrote what actually happened, and it was based upon you know, the Alcatraz movie, people writing books that really didn't have any knowledge of what actually happened. It's like Mike said he wrote in the beginning of our book, you know, when people don't have the information, they tend to fill it in with speculation and theories. And just like I was talking to Mike about someone saying, well, they were making a comment about how we wrote the book and didn't really kind of portray Frank Morris as the mastermind and the brains. And they said, you know, it's well known that he was the mastermind. And I'm going, well known by who? I mean,
Exactly.
Who actually said this? You know, unless you read the FBI files, all you're doing is taking something that someone else regurgitated and said, well, this is my theory about what happened, because he's got 130 something IQ. You know, he undoubtedly must have been, but nowhere in the FBI files does it say that. And in fact, it says just the opposite.
Exactly. That's what I was going to get alluded to, because that's what it does say in the FBI files. It says that, you know, they underestimated who John really was, because John was the mastermind.
Yeah, I mean, even one of the prisoners that they interviewed later on said, well, if you want to know who was actually in charge of this, John Anglin would have been the leader if there was anyone. And then, of course, John is the one who mentions about, you know, using the prison boats as a means of getting off the island early on. And then he's also the one who mentioned about having alternate clothes. And so, you know, John and Clarence are the first ones out of the back of their cells. They're the ones who make all the dummy heads. They're the ones who make all the grills. And when you read Alan West's, and I'm not trying to take away from Frank Morris's contribution, he was very good in this. But even Alan West said that he didn't even invite Frank Morris until after the escape had already started. But then you hear other people say, no. Clint Eastwood had it all right. You know, Frank Morris was the brains, and the Anglin brothers were just lucky to go along.
Well,
I mean, I really believe that's because their superpower was that they were able to make people underestimate them.
I totally agree with that. Totally.
You know, they were underestimated. People didn't realize who they were.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that in the book, it talks about when they're there at Alcatraz, they kept a really low profile.
Mm-hmm.
They were pretty stoic. And so they kind of blended in, and everyone they didn't make any noise. They didn't, you know, so they were like camouflaged in there.
I agree. It was a match made in heaven with them.
Yeah.
And it's funny now, because when you think about it, when you start looking, you know, because we had no clue about how many times that they've been escaping from places since they were, you know, little kids, and that the fact that they had that capability to just figure out how to get out of someplace and just kind of, all right, find the weak points. And that's what, you know, they learned that. Like, I go back to the 10,000 hour rule from Malcolm Gladwell's book. They had been doing it for so long, it became a reflex. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's great that the book really kind of illustrates all of that. And I think, you know, and that's why I urge everybody to go out and buy the book, because it really, I mean, we're only scratching the surface here talking about this. There's a lot of details that I can't, you know, that just come up. And I think it's really interesting that not only did they get out, but they were able to live out the rest of their lives. Do you know how long they probably lived in Rio?
You know, I really hope one day when Mike and I discover their relatives, and we are truly trying. I've been trying a lot of different avenues to reach out to people to see if we can find. I really don't know how long they lived. I just kind of base it upon how long the other Anglin brothers or their brothers would have lived. I know all of my uncles never really kind of made it past their early 80s. Some of them died in their 70s. My mom is, and her sister are probably definitely are the oldest ever living Anglin members. My mom is about to turn 89, and her younger sister is 87. From all that I know, my grandfather lived to be 92, so he was the oldest. I really seriously doubt that they're alive, unless maybe John, if I had to put money on anybody still being alive today, it would probably be John.
That's amazing.
Yeah, Frank Morse would be, he was born in 26, so he'd be 98 right now. So he's probably gone. And Clarence was a lifelong smoker. I mean, even in the picture, the famous early 70s picture of the two of them in Brazil, you can see in Clarence's pocket, he's got a pack of cigarettes in his pocket. Mm-hmm. You can see the little square outline. So, he probably died before John did. Probably, well, we don't know when, but younger because of all the smoking.
We need to find him.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
We have tried, and like Ken said, the search for us now is the family, because Fred Breezy said in the 92 interview that they had married and that they had 7 children, 4 with one, 3 with the other. So this is in 90s, early 90s at the time. So, by now those children would have had their own children. So there'd be grandchildren. And fortunately, Ken has been able to use his mother's DNA, because she's obviously the closest living relative to the brothers, their siblings. So, Ken could have done his own DNA, but that's a lesser, value, because, you have you have another non-relative donating their DNA. So the mother, we have that DNA. And unfortunately in Brazil, they do have a national database for DNA, but it's only accessible to Brazilians, to citizens. Non-citizens, it's against the law for non-citizens to have their DNA tested and get access to the database. So we don't have that ability to go that route until the laws change. Now, we have done Ancestry DNA and the other one.
23andMe.
Yeah, 23andMe. And that gives us access to approximately 40 million people that are in the database. However, Brazil alone has a population of over 200 million people. That's like 220, 230. So, and this is global, this is, 40 million of total people, most of whom were in the United States and in Europe. So the odds of us finding somebody that matches his DNA in Brazil is very, very low. So we're trying to find other ways to try to get family members to come forward to say, yeah, I think that was my grandfather, that was my father, or kind of a thing. And not successful yet, but that is, we're pursuing that.
Well, I imagine they had different names and different IDs too, as well.
There is that too. I think I mentioned the story before. The guy who robbed the bank 50 years ago. He was in his early 20s, robs a bank, gets a couple $100,000, and then he just falls off the face of the earth. He just disappears. He's presumed dead. Well, 50 years later, he resurfaces, and he had changed his name, moved to a different part of the country, became a pillar of the community. And I think he had cancer and he was dying. Well, just before he died, he told his family who he really was. They had no idea that he had robbed this bank, and he changed his name. And so we think that's probably likely for the family, that the brothers changed their name, kind of hid their past. Probably maybe even the spouses didn't know. We can't say, but probably the children didn't know who their fathers really were. There could have been a deathbed confession, maybe. We don't know. So there's a strong likelihood they may not know who they are.
But one of the paths that I've been trying to go down and have been unsuccessful with is we know the area that the farm and where they lived at one point in time. I don't know whether or not they sold the land and it became something else, but I've tried to reach out to multiple newspapers down there, and I've been trying my best I want to take out a full page ad, and I wanted to put multiple pictures in there of them, from young kids to, you know, when they last photographed that we had, even in the one that we have from Brazil, and just tell the story about who they are. And my mom and her sister, the only two living relatives, you know, wanting to find their brothers, and hopes that maybe someone would pick that newspaper up and go, you know what, he looks very familiar, and reach out to us, and we make a connection that way. But it is so impossible to get anyone down there to contact me or let, you know, contact me back. I've sent emails. I've tried to WhatsApp, and I did get one individual where I really thought was going to be a potential to help me. All I want to do is tell me how much the ad is, and I will create it, send it down to you, and you put it in your paper. And I cannot get anyone to do it. I just can't get anybody to respond to me.
I might be able to help you with that. I have
I will do it tomorrow if you can find somebody.
Yeah, it's a language barrier.
Yeah, that, and there's a lot of things. I can reach out to a few people.
You do that, and I will put it in the paper as soon as possible.
Okay. Well, good. Well, this is a great place to end it. I think this was awesome, and I think we're, like I said, there's still so much to go over here, and so thanks for.
Oh yeah, we haven't even gotten to the evidence yet.
No,
Exactly.
no,
Yeah,
so much.
They're still in prison. They haven't even escaped yet.
They haven't even left.
They haven't even left. All right, guys.
Both.
All right. Thank you.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.